All right, so we're in Genesis. What, though, before we even get started, what does the word Genesis mean and where does it come from? Beginning? Origin. Yeah. Source. It comes from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. That's actually where we get the word Genesis from. And it means origin, it means source.
What it doesn't mean is necessarily is time. It's regarding mostly the origin, the things that took effect or happened, but not necessarily time.
Yeah, it just means the source of something. So the word itself, Genesis, just means the source of something or the origin of something, where it originated from, that kind of idea. And the word is found about 12 times in the book of Genesis itself. Obviously, we're talking about the Greek translation of the Old Testament. That word is found 12 times. And it's translated as origins or generations or account, those kind of ideas. And the book itself divides into about 10 sections. You can take the book of Genesis and you kind of divide it up into 10 sections. And each of those sections begin with something like, these are the generations of, or these are the accounts of, something along those lines. So it's the book of origins, it's the book of beginnings. So we should expect to read about the beginning of certain things, peoples, families, events, and that's really what we find. So when you think about the book of Genesis, we ought to be thinking origins, source, beginnings, that kind of idea. It's foundational. We think of it as being the first book of the Bible, and certainly it is. And it's foundational, though. Even within that name, it's that idea of a foundation. So, for example, Genesis contains the history of and the origin of the material universe, right? Everybody knows that. We get that in chapter 1. So you get the history of the origin, the source. Where did everything come from? Well, Genesis tells us. It gives us the origin of humanity. Where did the human family come from? Well, how did that all begin? It's found in Genesis. What about sin? Where does sin come from? What is sin? I mean, we get a picture of where it came from, what sin is, all of that in Genesis. And then, of course, we get the origin or the beginning of the nation of Israel, the Hebrew nation, the Israelite nation there. So if I were to ask you what is the theme of the book of Genesis, you would tell me, what's the theme of the book of Genesis?
The origins, the beginning.
Yeah, it's not a trick question. It's the origin. It's the book. It's the book of beginnings. It's the book of the source of where everything comes from. If I want to know the origin of something, I can go to Genesis and find the source of it. So in Genesis, we have the beginning of absolutely every major doctrine in the Bible. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to find the details, every kind of nuanced detail in there, but every major biblical doctrine is found in Genesis. So anything you can think of. Redemption. Is redemption found in Genesis? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Creation. Creation is found in Genesis. The idea that God is creator is found in Genesis. The human family is found in Genesis. All of that kind of stuff. So man, sin, redemption, all of that's found in there.
I wanted to ask a question that Dick made me think of. It had never occurred to me before, but since Genesis doesn't mean time, it means the world was created before time, right? There was no time when the world was created, so therefore what we measure may not be recorded in...
Well, God brings about time, right? In the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth, all that kind of stuff. So he's bringing forth time. Now, prior to creation, there's no time. It's eternity, right? God is there. But yes, he's bringing time into effect. And so you even get the days of creation and the cycle and all of that. And we're told time is kind of going on. But the word itself, Genesis, just means source, origin, can mean generations, that kind of idea. So it doesn't have a time element to it necessarily, other than saying the beginning, the point at which something starts. All right, so with that being said, how important would you say is the book of Genesis? With all that we said so far.
On a rating of 1 to 10, I'd give it a 10.
Yeah. Again, that's a kind of a no-brainer. Do you think that the book of Genesis is a book that we ought to be studying? That we ought to maybe spend a lot of time in? If it is the book of beginnings, wouldn't that tell us that maybe we should spend time in that? If we want to understand the rest of the Bible, Genesis is going to be the place, one of the main places we ought to be going to understand everything else, right? Because the source of everything, the origin of everything, doesn't matter if you're talking about redemption of Jesus, it doesn't matter if you're talking about sin or salvation, it doesn't matter if you're talking about the creator of the universe, it doesn't matter if you're talking about marriage, children, these big major kind of ideas all find their beginnings in the book of beginnings. We ought to master this book. This ought to be a book that we go to. My suggestion would be at least every year we're in there kind of going through this. Because again, this is going to lay the foundation for other texts. I'll give you one example. If I were to say to you, in the beginning, what book am I quoting? Maybe. Could be. Right? In the beginning, John, the Gospel of John says, in the beginning was the Word. Now, what is John alluding to?
Right.
Well, he's alluding to Jesus, but he's going back to Genesis. He's taking the very first words out of the Greek, the Septuagint, the Old Testament. He's taking the very first words, and he's trying to explain to us who Jesus is. So when we read back in Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then we read John chapter 1, which says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were created by Him or through Him, right? All of that. So is Jesus in Genesis?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Let us make God in our image.
That's right. Yes, that's right. So that just gives us an idea that Genesis is very important. And it should be one of the books that we study over and over and over again, really getting into the meat of it. There are two major themes that run throughout the Bible. Two major themes. One of them is Exodus. The idea of going into captivity and coming out of captivity. So, for example, we could speak about the Israelites' exodus out of Egypt, right? Everybody knows that, the book of Exodus. But are there other exoduses that the Bible talks about? I'll give you a hint. Yeah, there's other exoduses. We could talk about there's some, when the people of God go into captivity in Babylon, do they have an exodus out of there? There is. God brings them back into the land, right? Is there another exodus that we might think about?
Yes, there is.
There is? Yes, there is. There's a number of them, but then we can think about the exodus. How about our exodus? Did we have an exodus?
Out of the world.
Yeah, out of the world, that's right. Sin, Satan, and death. There's parallels between Egypt, Pharaoh, and the slavery that was there for the children of Israel, the people of God there. There's similarities. That whole event, that Exodus story, the whole thing is really a picture. It was all true. It all happened, right? The Exodus literally happened in, the book of Exodus. But that was a picture prophesying what was to come later on in Jesus Christ. All of that is, and we could spend time talking about it. The people of Israel, when they come out of captivity to Egypt, they walk through the Red Sea. They're baptized into Moses, we're told. There's a baptism. We're baptized into Christ. We come out of the world. They walk and wander through a wilderness world, right? We still wander in a wilderness world. God guides them by the pillar and the cloud, right? The Spirit of God indwells, guides us through this wander, right? God is with us even today. They were headed to a promised land. We are headed to the home of glory, all of that kind of stuff, right? So there's parallels, and these are meant to point us to Christ. The other major theme in the Bible is creation. Genesis talks about creation, but then we hear about this new creation. Isn't there a new creation?
Yeah. New heaven, new earth.
New heavens and new earth. We are new creations in Christ, right? Isn't that true? All of that language is kind of bringing us back to Genesis. And Genesis is meant to point us forward to Jesus. I'll give you a couple kind of glimpses here real quick, and then we'll, I was talking to Shannon. She's going to do Genesis tonight with the kids too, and talk about the days of creation, got a little song and all that. But I asked her these questions. What day did God create life? The first life.
Day 6.
Well, 6 is when he creates animals and man. Yeah. When does he create the first living thing?
When he created the plants.
Yeah, day 3. Day 3. So life begins on day 3. Now, we're going to talk quickly here. We're not going to get into detail at this point. But so life begins on day 3. What day did Jesus rise?
Third day.
Oh, life, right? There's a connection there. What day of the week did Jesus rise from the dead? Well, it was on the 3rd day, but what day of the week do we call that?
Sunday.
Sunday, which is the
Lord's Day.
first day of the week. What day did God create light?
Thursday.
Jesus is the light of the world. And there's a lot of parallels that we could get into, but just kind of throwing some stuff out there at the moment, just to say, again, Genesis is very, very important, something we should get into. If you want to study, obviously anything in the New Testament, we should be studying Genesis, but if you want to study Revelation, what book do you think you might want to study before you get to Revelation? There's a number of them, but what book might you want to study?
You want to say Genesis?
Genesis. Absolutely.
That was not a trick.
No, I'm trying. Listen, I'm trying not to be tricky. Can I get somebody to read? I've got what? 1, 2, 3. I got 3 texts I want us to think about, just to kind of bring home this point. Can I get 3 people who want to read? Any 3? Anybody? 1, 2. Did you say you would read?
Yeah, I'll read.
3. All right. So we'll go in that order. 1, 2, 3. So could you? They're all going to be in Revelation because we're making the point here. So it's going to be Revelation chapter 2, verse 7 will be the first one. Richard, it'll be Revelation 5:5, and Mike, it'll be Revelation 14:10. 2:7, 5:5, and 14:10.
2:7.
Yes, please. Whenever you get it.
He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God.
Where's that reference found? Where's that allusion found?
Tree of life.
Genesis. It's the tree of life. Revelation 5:5.
Then one of the elders said to me, "Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals."
Genesis 49, 9 through 10 speaks about Judah as a lion. There's these images going back to Genesis. The last one is Revelation 14:10.
He also will drink the wine of God's wrath and his anger, and he will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb.
Fire and sulfur. What's that sound like?
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Sodom and Gomorrah, found in Genesis. So really just trying to drive home the point that if you want to study the book of Revelation, and I've taught it before and I've contemplated, maybe in the future we'll do that. We can't do that if we don't know Genesis. We can't do that if we don't know the Old Testament prophets. That's why people have all kinds of weird, crazy, wild ideas. A lot of people are Old Testament illiterate. They don't understand how the Old Testament prophets spoke. They might not have a good understanding of Genesis, so it's important. And of course, there are other New Testament books that reflect back and refer back to Genesis. So Matthew 23:35 mentions Adam, and Matthew 24:37 mentions Noah. So we have all these references in the New Testament and really throughout the Bible that bring us all the way back to Genesis. So really the point I just wanted to drive home is that this is an important book. If you were to study this book once a year, you'd be doing well. There's a couple of those books. We should be reading and studying all the Bible as much as we can, but there are some books that just, there's something really weighty and important about it that references, is going to be referenced and important for other New Testament ideas and things of that nature.
1 Peter 3 also mentions Noah.
Yes, absolutely. Right in the flood of Noah, and how 8 were saved through water, and how baptism now saves us. Absolutely. So many, 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 many references all the way back to Genesis. So important book. Any questions, thoughts, or comments on just some of the stuff that we've talked about so far? If not, let's read the text. I'm going to read all of chapter 1. If you haven't noticed already, I like to read long texts, long portions of text, or have them read on Sunday morning. We're going to read all of chapter 1. We'll read all of chapter 1. So we've got 31 verses. So 3 people? If 3 people want to read, I don't know. How much reading do you guys want to do tonight? If you want to do a reading, raise your hand. You can do. All right, Gail, you can do the first 10 if you wouldn't mind. You want to pick up after that, and then I'll pick up the leftovers unless somebody really wants to read. No? All right. You'll do the last part? All right, wonderful. So Gail and Janice and then Bill. Whenever you're ready. All right, so what theories about the origin of life are generally accepted by people in our society? What are some of the... Evolution. Evolution, that's the big one. That's a popular one. Everything came from what? Where did everything come from?
One cell.
One cell, yeah. Further back came from a Big Bang that came from nowhere. So there's this idea that from nothing came something. Or there was, nowadays they try to nuance some stuff. Well, there was something there. It was like a super small thing that was smaller than the head of a pin, and then it blew up. But basically, nothing gives rise to everything, that kind of idea. And we all go back to a single cell. We really come from rocks, because the rain watered the rocks and the rain mixed somehow, and we came from that kind of thing.
Yeah, God made the rocks.
So evolution is a big one, that everything came from nothing, and we all evolved. What does Genesis 1:1 tell us, though?
God created.
God created. In the beginning, God created. So what does that idea demolish? If we go with the Bible, what is that already telling us?
But there was a creator. It didn't happen just by chance.
Yeah. Yeah, it didn't come from nothing. There's a creator God involved. So this idea that everything came from nothing, random, that's denied by the Bible itself. So in the beginning, God created. What else does it deny? What else does it destroy? What other kind of ideas that are out there?
Man can neither create or destroy.
Okay. God is the one who's doing all that, man. That's actually a law, right? There's, what is it? Energy can neither be created nor destroyed, just can be transferred. You know, there's a transference of energy and things of that nature. There are ideas out there, maybe not very popular anymore, not held, but they're, well, maybe they're still out there. This idea that there were many gods in the universe. Does Genesis deny that? How many gods are in the beginning? Just one. Just one. There's only one God in the beginning. So the idea of polytheism, right? Many gods is out there. What about this idea that God is everything? Right? Pantheism, everything is God. God is everything. Have you ever heard that before? As a New Age kind of philosophy, there's people out there who actually believe that they are God. That they're a God. You can be a God if you just recognize that you're, that you actually are God. You can recreate and all that kind of stuff. Does Genesis confirm or deny that? Denies that, right? Denies that. God is not in everything because God, well, he created everything. So the rock is not God, right?
No.
The tree is not God. These are things that God created. So these kind of ideas are just, Genesis kind of, just the first verse really kind of does away with a lot of these ideas. So God is the creator and not random chance and time, things of that nature. The universe did not self-generate itself. It didn't just spontaneously pop into existence. There's a mind behind the universe. God created both heaven and earth. When it says in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, what do you think that means?
Is the firmament the ground?
No,
No. Okay.
it's the sky.
No.
Yeah. We'll get there, but just to kind of talk about it really briefly, is it appears that from the reading of Genesis, it appears that the earth was covered with water all over, and that God separated a space, and that there was some kind of it's called the canopy theory, that there was probably some kind of a water canopy. How that was, don't really know, but God separates the waters above and the waters below, and in the middle is the sky. So this is a good thing to bring up now, because I asked you, what does it mean that God created the heavens and the earth? And when you hear the word heaven nowadays, what typically comes to mind? What do you think of?
Where God dwells.
Yeah, where God dwells, that kind of idea. But verse 7, depending on your translation, says heaven. So is that where God dwells? In the sky?
No.
No. What's it saying?
The universe, isn't that what he's created
Well,
here?
where it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Actually, heavens and earth is a way, and you can look at this throughout the scriptures. It's a way of saying everything. He's not saying the heaven and just, the earth and just heaven, that kind of, it's a way of just saying it all. It's an all-encompassing kind of idea. God created, so you could translate it, in the beginning, God created everything. That's really what it's saying. He created the heaven and the earth. It's just a way of saying everything. Because God will say, I will call heaven and earth to testify. He's saying everything. All of my creation I will bring to testify against you, kind of idea. Go ahead.
Well, heaven is plural too. It says he created the heavens and the earth.
Yeah.
So there's different heavens. I mean, maybe it's
Well, that text there, again, that text is just saying he created everything, right? But the word heaven, is used both of the sky, verse 7, as well as what we consider as the heavenly realms, a place where God dwells or something like that. Now, Paul does talk about a man who went to the third heavens, that kind of idea. And there's discussion over what Paul is kind of talking about there. And were there three levels? Was he talking about the sky, what we call space, and then the heavenly abode of God, that kind of... there's debate over what he means and what's going on there. But the word heaven can have a range of meanings. And that's important for us to understand. So whenever you come across this word, again, depending on your translation, you have to look at the context. Context is very important. So verse 7 is clearly talking about the sky. It's not talking about the abode of God. Verse 1 is not talking about, is even trying to separate that God just created the earth and God created the heavenly abode. It's saying that he created absolutely everything. So he created the stars. He created the solar systems, right? It's a way of just saying it's all inclusive. It's all inclusive. So in the beginning, God created absolutely everything.
And I think it's interesting to mention that some say it was a one-celled animal.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
everything came from.
Mm-hmm.
But God created this without any pre-existing materials at all.
You're right, right. The fancy word is ex nihilo, right? And which just means it just means out of nothing. It's sometimes you can write it in your notes if you want. Just means it's a fancy way of saying God created out of nothing. And that's important though. And again, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, when we read that, it should remind us of John 1:1. We should be pointed towards Jesus. Everything in the scriptures, and Jesus talked about this, but everything all the way back points to Christ in some form or fashion. So to see those connections is important, it's good. Who is said to be the creator in Genesis? It's God. God is the creator. Who is said to be the creator in John chapter 1, 1 through 3? It's Jesus. Jesus. Hebrews 1:2 talks about it. Colossians 1:16. It's Jesus. Jesus is there as well. Bernie, he brought out earlier that when you look at Genesis 1:26, it says, then God said, now listen, then God said, let us make man in our image and after our likeness. So there's a plurality. Now, if we only had that text, we might theorize that maybe the angels were involved, right? Maybe God's speaking to the angels.
If we only had that text, we wouldn't even know these angels.
Well, that's true. That's true. But if you look at verse 27, it says, so God created man in his. Is that singular or plural? Singular. In his own image. In the image of God, he, singular, created him. Male and female, he. So notice that when God speaks of himself, he speaks of himself in the plural. When man speaks of God, because this is a comment about what God did by Moses, Moses speaks of God in the singular. So we have a plurality, a singular polarity, we might say. So this is that one of those first ideas that gets developed later on, which some people today call the Trinity, or the Godhead, or the triune nature of God. Now, we don't get three out of this text, but we do get the idea that God is one, and yet there's a plurality, right? So when you read that text, there's something going on here. God speaks of himself in the plural. When man speaks about God, it's in the singular. So there is only one God, and yet that one God has a plural nature. There's something there that he can speak of himself in the plural. So again, the beginnings of some of these important truths that come up later.
Do you get the third Godhead in the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Is that the whole?
Well, we get in the beginning God, and then we talk about the Spirit of God, but where's the third? We just don't get it develops later. Now, the origin of what we consider as the Godhead, the triune nature of God, the origin is found in Genesis. Remember I said at the beginning, all the major doctrines are foundationally found in Genesis, but not all the details. So we don't get all the details about this God who is a single being, and yet in some ways there's a plural nature to this God.
So the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters is God.
Yes.
Would not be the Holy Spirit.
Well, that is the Spirit of God, which is
The Holy Spirit.
God.
Yes.
God the Spirit, however you want to say it, yes. Yes. And then we match this up with John chapter 1. And what we have to do is we have to look at multiple texts to get this idea that there's a triune nature to God. 3 persons, 1 God kind of thing. But the beginnings of it are found right here. And actually, it comes up again when God says, let us go down and check out what man's doing. And then it says God, and he speaks of God in the singular. Again, when man in the Old Testament speaks of God, it's often in the singular, and God speaks of himself in the plural. So, oh, careful. You raise your hand, you do an itch, I'll call on you. You're like, oh, I'm just scratching my head. Watch out. You did have a comment. Yes, go ahead.
Where it says what God said, we know that in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. So would that be Jesus speaking?
Yeah, we're not given a whole lot of real detail. We put the two together, and we do get the idea that Jesus is the creator from John. John says Jesus is the one who's creating. But we're not given all those details. We're not given all those kind of details as to how it works exactly, but we do know that the Father is God. What we say is Jesus the Son is God. The Holy Spirit is God. And yet we're told there's only one God. So that's where we get that idea of the triune nature of God. But again, the details, we're not given a lot of those kind of individual details. But I would definitely mark and put a reference, John 1, Genesis 1. Clearly John is relying on Genesis and really trying to say, when John opens up his gospel, he's really trying to say, let me tell you who Jesus is. Jesus is the creator. Go back to Genesis. Again, not all the details of how is the Father working and the Son and the Spirit. We know the Spirit is hovering over the waters. He's brooding over the waters. The imagery there, we're out of time, but the imagery there is that of a mother hen or a bird hovering over her chicks, her nest. There's a brooding there. There's a tension. So the Spirit of God is actively kind of getting ready to do things, I guess, in concert with the Father, and we would say the Son as well.